Thank you, Father, for this wonderful opportunity to discuss your word, Father. I ask that you, through your Spirit, help us to understand and reveal your truth to us in a special way. Help us to extract the wisdom from your word and apply it to our lives. I ask it all in the mighty name of Yeshua Mashiach. Amen. All right, so Shabbat Shalom. We are continuing with the book of James. Now, last time I think we only got to verse 2. Now, tonight we're going to jump on and do another 2 verses. So I don't know how long this book is going to take, but it takes as long as it takes. So I'm trying to uncover all the gems within the word and lay enough foundation for us to move forward to understand the context of what James was trying to say. So it will take a bit of time to lay the foundation, and then we'll probably speed up as we progress. Now, just for interest's sake, this is just the overall map of the layout of the book. So 1 verse 1 is basically the greeting, which we spent some time on last week. We discussed the concept of a bondservant, the concept of Israel, and also the more or less the time frame of which this book was written in, and the audience or the people that the book was written to when they lived. So, and this is also a book that is relevant to us living in the last days. This week we're going to start with the next phase, which is basically titled Wisdom and Joy. Now, James is known as the book of wisdom because he quotes a lot of passages found in Proverbs and other places in the Tanakh that highlights wisdom or extracts wisdom, and he presents that to the people in a practical way, in a practical sense, based on the issues that they faced during those times. So we're going to spend some time on this theme, wisdom and joy, in the context or the backdrop of trials and tribulations. So that's the main mixture or the main theme. Now, when we move on, it will be 1 verse 19 to 26 to chapter 2 to 26 is wisdom and obedience, and then chapter 3 to 4 is wisdom and peace. Then chapter 4 and 5 is wisdom and the future. And then chapter 5 ends with wisdom and prayer. So we're going to jump right in. But before we go into the actual text, I just want to lay some foundation. Now, last time I spoke about the context of the audience, and I compared that to the 2 first churches as described in Revelation 2, where Yahweh gave accommodations to those churches because they were persecuted. Now, what I'm going to explain in this teaching is to lay some foundation in the time frame, but with the backdrop of the work of Mashiach and the time frame of his work, and overlaying this book, specifically actually all of the Brit Hadashah, all of the New Testament books, within a time frame of relevance. So to get the idea of that, we need to compare the actual work of Mashiach during his first coming to the festivals. So there were 7 festivals. The first 3 festivals had to do with his first coming. So Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits were the first coming of Mashiach. And then the last 3 festivals, which are the 4 festivals, are trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. They associate with Mashiach's second coming. Now, in the middle, we see that Pentecost is basically in between the 2 comings. And we've got a time period from the end of first fruits and the beginning of trumpets that give us the time frame that we actually, as New Testament or followers of Mashiach, exist from the time of the first century church to the time of the 7th church or assembly described in the book of Revelation, which is also known as the last generation. Now, what we see in this is that Pentecost is right smack in the middle of that time period. Now, I've got the two fish there at the bottom just to give us the concept of the age of the Gentiles. Now, the fish has to do with that through the meaning of the tribe of Ephraim. Now, Ephraim means double fruitfulness, and fruitfulness is depicted by a fish. So double fruitfulness is two fish, and in one of the Torah portions there were two inverted nuns, and in between the two inverted nuns there were the scripture basically that they use when they take out the Torah, when they put back the Torah. Preceding that first nun was about the Gentiles, and after the second inverted nun is about the kingdom. So we see that the time frame in between the two nuns is basically the same as between the two comings of Mashiach. Now, what does that mean in relation to Ephraim? Now, Ephraim was the tribe associated with Joseph, and the prophecy given to Joseph by his father Jacob was that he will be like a wild branch growing over the wall, going into the field, and he will be hated, basically. He will be persecuted in a sense. And that is the theme or the concept of the New Testament believers, or the Messianic believers, or the Christians as we know them, who will go out into the world, into the field, and spread the message of the gospel. Now, that translated through the tribe of Ephraim, and he depicted that tribe of the followers of Mashiach bringing in the nations. Now, the other concept that's associated with the fish is that Yeshua called the disciples fishers of men, and they had to cast their nets into the sea in order to bring the fish out into the boat. Now, the boat represents salvation. The sea or the ocean represents the nations. And we need to bring the nations, the people from the nations, from the world, into the boat, into salvation. And we need to facilitate that process through our lives, which are depicted by the net. And that is the symbolism of Ephraim, the fish, the double fish. And to overlay that with a time frame or an age, the two fish is also the sign of Pisces, which is a 2,000-year age or period, which is called the age of the Gentiles. So between the first and second coming of Mashiach, there's a 2,000-year period. Now, that is where the work of Mashiach come into play through his followers, where he returned back to the Father, he gave his Spirit to us, and through the empowerment and the anointing of his Spirit, we now represent him on earth. So through us, he will do his work through the power of the Spirit, and we will facilitate the process of bringing the nations in. So in saying that, the time period or the relevance of the Brit Hadashah sit right smack between first fruits and trumpets. And we have the concept of the work of Mashiach in relation to Pentecost. Now, Pentecost is associated with Mount Sinai and the receiving of the commandments, as well as the receiving of the Spirit. Now, after they received the commandments, they traveled through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. Now, the promised land is depicted by tabernacles or Sukkot. So the traveling through the wilderness and Pentecost is basically what we face between the two comings of Mashiach. And that also gives us the theme and the backdrop for the New Testament believers, for the believers following Mashiach after his first coming, that they will need to embrace the commandments, the Torah, which is depicted by Pentecost. They need the power of the Spirit, which write the commandments on their hearts, that will empower and enable them to travel through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. Now, the Torah has the information or the directions that lead to the promised land. It's also symbolized by water, where Paul said that we need the washing of the water of the word to prepare the bride for the coming. So trumpet is where Mashiach will come as the groom to collect his bride, and that's the second part of the wedding ceremony. So for us to prepare, we need to embrace the Torah, wash ourselves, cleanse ourselves, but we also need to experience the wilderness as a character building and as a cleansing period in our lives to prepare ourselves to be ready for the trumpets experience. So we need both. So people, we find three kinds of people within that time frame. First of all, you get the people who only travel to the mountain. They refuse to accept the mountain. They refuse to accept the commandments. So they are in front of the mountain and they are confronted with the golden calf. And that's where the false doctrines and the false religions and the things will come into play, mixing and confusing the people through the worship of linking things to the world, linking things to other religions, and they bring that into a mixed faith and try to worship Yahweh that way. Now, he is not pleased with people doing that. He wants us to go up the mountain, to embrace the commandments, to cleanse ourselves from the previous life, the previous worldly ways, and the previous basic religions that we were indulged in. And we need to separate ourselves. So moving beyond the mountain, we have access to the wilderness. Now, the wilderness is the place where you will meet the enemy. That's where the enemy will tempt you. Just like Yeshua was tempted in the wilderness, we will be tempted in the wilderness as well. So that is basically the premise for the book of James, why he says what he said. So he said, count it all joy when you go through trials and tribulations. He was basically referring to the wilderness period because the end of that period, the end goal of that experience is the promised land, is the end goal, is where we enter into the promised land, into the presence of the Father. So that's just a bit of context in the time frame. Now, the other thing I want to highlight here is how do we interpret and study the Brit Hadashah? Now, we have a book translated in English. When we go back to the oldest translation, which is the King James, it's a bit more difficult because we don't talk like that anymore. It's difficult to understand that kind of English. And English in itself had a bit of a revolution, a change throughout the ages. And words back then don't mean the same as words currently. For example, the word gay back in the day meant happy. Now it means homosexual. So even reading the Old King James with a Western modern mindset of understanding of the English language, we will not grasp the fullness of the language. So how do we overcome that? We need to go back one step further and dip into the Greek language. Now, luckily, we have dictionaries, and we can read the true meaning of the words, and then we can see where those words were used elsewhere in Scripture to give us the understanding of the application and what those words really mean. So that's the approach that I'm taking into studying this book. We need to go back to the most original form of that book, which currently is Greek. Now, there's another layer that I don't have evidence of in this study, but there's a rabbi called Adrian Gabriel Roth, and he wrote, Andrew Gabriel Roth, and he wrote the book, The Way of Life, and it's basically explaining the fact that most of the New Testament were written in Aramaic. And he has the examples of two sets of scrolls, both in Greek, but they differ from one another. And when you look at the meanings that they translated into Greek, and you take it back to the Aramaic root word, you can see those meanings appear in the dictionary, and the translators, different translators chose different Aramaic meanings, or the Greek meanings for the Aramaic word, to translate into their scrolls. So we've got evidence of that to show that these books are actually written in Aramaic. And that also might explain why the Greek scriptures or the Greek scrolls only appeared 100 and 150 years after the fact, because I believe the original were captured in Aramaic and then later on translated into Greek to reach the nations. So that's also something, if we have access to those things, to those scrolls within the Aramaic, that will even open up this book even more. So what I'm doing, I'm going into the Greek, look at the meanings, and then I find the closest Hebrew word that's got the same meaning, and then go back into the Torah or into the Tanakh to find the true meaning, and then relate it back into the Brit Hadashah to get that true meaning. The other benefit that we have is that a lot of statements that was made by Paul and James and Peter and John are actually quoted from the Tanakh, so we can actually find the actual passage in the Torah and the context to really study and understand what they were trying to say. Now, the most important thing that we need to understand is that these people lived back about 2,000 years in a different culture, and we, from a modern culture, try to interpret and understand what someone wrote to someone else. So it's very important to get the context, to understand the culture, to go as far back into the language as we can to get that true meaning. So that's the premise of my study, and that's what I want to try and convey to you guys, because I not only want to teach from the scripture itself, I also want to teach you the tools and give you the tools to decipher and to search the scriptures yourself, including the Brit Hadashah. So enough said on that. Let's get into James 1 verse 2 to 4. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now, if you just read it like this and you think about and you meditate on what James was actually saying, he's saying something more than we normally read. So basically what it's alluding to is that these people, they struggled with not having enough faith. They had a lack of knowledge. They were impatient. They were incomplete. They had various areas, including spiritual immaturity amongst them. And the inner work hasn't been complete in some of them, that caused imperfections. And that all resulted into needs and lack as well. So he's basically underlying the majority of the issues within that congregation, or within the overall body as he saw it back then. So the majority of these issues were internal issues. They were spiritual related issues, and only one of them are external, which are your physical needs. And so the majority of the work that needs to happen within them are on a spiritual level, not only to give them what they need, but also to help them to overcome their inward immaturity and all the spiritual gaps that exist within them. So how is this done from Yahweh's perspective? Now, whenever there's an imbalance in the nature or in the spiritual, there's always a reaction to bring things back into balance. So any imperfection that we have spiritually causes an imbalance, and there's a cause and effect that will try and push that balance back into a neutral position. Now, that pushing back we perceive as persecution and tests. So we can basically say that all these things that they experience and that we currently also experience as trials or tests and tribulations are the consequences of these shortcomings in our lives that try to push us back. Now, how it works is that people will not change unless they are challenged. Now, what challenges us is the idea of what it's called dissonance. So dissonance is when you are presented with something that is not part of you. It's not part of your nature, but you see it in someone else, or you read it in scripture. Now, when you see that or when you read that, that will cause an uneasiness in you. And you've got two ways to deal with that uneasiness. Either you say that whatever I read or whatever I see in someone else, I disqualify that as not the truth, and what I believe is the truth, and then you will not change and you will go back to your normal state. The other thing is that dissonance will cause you to question your own belief system and challenge your belief system. And if you believe that what you are challenged with is the truth, then you are forced to change to get rid of that dissonance. And it's built into us. We cannot exist within a state of dissonance. You have to go one way or the other. Now, walking in set apartness or walking in holiness, we basically present dissonance or a different way of walking in Yahweh's word to our fellow brothers that does not share the same beliefs as us. And if we believe it's the truth, it will create dissonance in them. They can either disqualify that or they can change, but something needs to happen. So Yahweh uses that in order to challenge us. But if we do not adhere to that, then there's another imbalance that he needs to take care of. And sometimes he uses external means to bring us back into balance. So we'll have a look at that a bit later on. So the question is, why persecution and why trials? Surely we as children of Yahweh should be blessed. We should not experience any lack, any loss, any pain, anything bad. But if you look through history, if you read the history of the prophets, the history of the disciples and the apostles, most of them were persecuted. Most of them went through extremely difficult times because of their faith. And even Yeshua said, a servant is not greater than their master. If they persecute me, they will persecute you as well. Because we are different, we are set apart, and we will attract persecution towards us if we create dissonance within the world and the people amongst us. Now, the other example I want to use is the internal persecution that we have, and that's a struggle within the inner man. So we have a righteous person or a person or new man that's reborn, and we have the old man living in the same house. Now, those two are depicted by the two concepts called the Neshama and the Nefesh, or Esau and Jacob. Now, the Nefesh is the physical desires, the means to want to stay alive and to procreate and to like things. It's your personality, your likes and dislikes. But the inner man is basically following Yahweh's ways, Yahweh's desires. And the old man and the new man sometimes differ in opinion. And then that creates dissonance within you. Now, either you submit to the flesh, to the nefesh, and go that way and disqualify the neshama or the new man, or you overcome the struggles or the challenges of the flesh and start to walk in holiness. So that's what Yahweh wants to do, but that is created within us through the help of the Spirit. Now, to explain that in a physical form, that imbalance that we create is basically, if you eat unhealthy, if you do not exercise and you live an unhealthy lifestyle, you are actually creating an imbalance that will manifest in some way, shape, or form as a sickness or a disease or a pain or a whatever. So in order to deal with that, it's not only going to help to pray for a miracle, you need to change your habits, you need to change your lifestyle in order to live a life of an overcomer. You cannot just have a quick fix. That's why sometimes when you pray for healing for people, they won't get healed because they haven't changed their bad habits. They're still subject to their flesh. They just want a quick fix. And Yahweh knows everybody's heart, he knows everybody's thoughts, and he will not give you a quick fix. It's like a drug addict and say, oh, I won't take drugs anymore, but I just need this last one. Just give me that fix. He wants you to come clean. He wants you to get rid of those bondages, and he will not give you that quick fix. So that's why we need to look internally into ourselves whenever we go through any challenge, whether it's sickness, whether it's lack, whether it's a relationship issue or whatever. We need to look inwardly into yourself to see what is out of balance within me that is causing this repercussion, this imbalance manifesting as an illness or a persecution or a trial in my life. So that is the way we need to look at things in order to overcome. And then we need wisdom. That's why James referred to this as the wisdom of Yahweh that will eventually help you to overcome, not just giving you what you need. You need wisdom to truly overcome these shortcomings. Now, within this imbalance, we can describe this in the means of spiritual forces or opposing forces. Now that is basically where this exists within the spiritual realm. Now there are two reasons for spiritual persecutions or spiritual trials. The first one is if you do not follow Yahweh's ways. Then Yahweh will create dissonance. He will create an imbalance that will force you to examine yourself. He will make a situation uncomfortable for you, allow that in your life so that you can return to Him. And we see that time and time and time again with Israel. Whenever they went into disobedience, not following Yahweh's ways, there was an enemy, took them over, take them into captivity, and they became slaves of that nation until they repented, and then they were released, and then they could serve Yahweh again. So it's a picture that's already existing within the pattern and the history of Israel that we can learn from. So it's still true today. Yahweh does not change. There's still consequences for sin, and if you create an imbalance, there's an opposing spiritual force that will be activated through an enemy that will bring you back. The best example to describe that is that the picture that He is the shepherd, we are the sheep. Whenever the sheep goes astray, He will send the sheepdog, which is Hasatan, the opposer, to go and nip you at your heel to bring you back into the gate. If you do not listen, you will get a bite from him. So the more you not work with Him, the more pain you will experience until you return. So you must always ask yourself, why does these things happen? There's another beautiful example of a sheep, that the little lamb or young sheep that goes astray. What the shepherd does, he breaks the legs of the sheep, and he put the sheep on his neck and he carries them. The reason for that is so that they can learn His voice. So whenever their legs are healed, when he put them down, they will know His voice intimately. And that's the reason why He allow bad things to happen to good people, because good people are going astray, not doing the right thing all the time. The other reason for trials and tribulations as a believer is whenever you do something good and righteous and you start walking in it, you draw attention from the world, from the other opposing force out there. And the good example of that is Job. Yahweh said, check out Job, he's a righteous man. And then he was challenged by Hasatan to be tested, and said, no, He will curse you if he goes through trials and tribulations. And Yahweh allowed Job to be tested. And at the end of that, Job was restored fully and multiplied in what he lost. But he overcame, and he was tested because he was righteous. So that's the two opposites. So you either bring trials and tribulations over your path because you disobey, or you bring trials and tribulations over your path because you are righteous. So either way, you will experience trials and persecution. And the reason for that is what I explained earlier. We are in the setting of the wilderness. The wilderness is not designed. I've got a slide for that somewhere. The wilderness is not designed for the flesh. It's designed so that the flesh can die and the spirit can grow. So we need to go through these things. The main thing we need to understand and to always remember, it's the attitude that you have while you are within a situation, in a difficult situation. Your attitude will determine your altitude. If you are having a bad attitude and you start to blame Yahweh and blame this one and blame that one, you are basically act out of unbelief. If you have a positive attitude and you ask Yahweh to reveal to you what the situation is, what you need to work on, that is similar to turning the other cheek. So when you get a slap from life, you turn the other cheek and you ask Yahweh, what should I learn from this? And then He will teach you. So that attitude of turning the other cheek, that attitude, that positive attitude of, I will overcome. Father, please teach me what I do wrong, or just show me, reveal to me why this is happening. If there's anything I have to learn in this, then teach me that. That is the right attitude. If you just sit there and complain to everybody and moan about this, and you complain about that, and you get no victory from it, that will just deplete your faith completely. You need to always act in faith in order to overcome. And that's where that inner strength needs to come into play. And we're going to have a look at that shortly. So just to recap, what are diverse temptations? Now, temptation is a Greek word, parasmos, and that means trial, temptation, or test. It comes from the root word perazzo, that means to try, to tempt, to test, to examine, to prove, and to temper. So examine yourself to prove yourself that you are on the right path. And the tempering is basically Yahweh molding us, Yahweh forming us, allowing that to happen. So it's not because he's angry or he's evil, it's because he's loving and kind, and he wants to create perfection. And we need to go through these things. Now, as I previously said, Yeshua was tempted, so we will be tempted as well. In John 15, verse 20, Yeshua said, "Remember the word that I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you as well." So to go through these trials and tribulations, we need to deal with them with the right attitude. We need to embrace that, basically, to see what we can learn from it, because it's a process of testing to examine, and your impurities will surface, and then you can deal with them. So from this, we see that it's an honor and a privilege to be persecuted. If you look at it from Job's perspective, he was a righteous man, and he drew the attention of the opposer, or from the enemy, or from people in the world. And then persecution came upon him because of his righteousness. Now, that is the kind of persecution Yeshua received. That's also the persecution that most of the apostles and the disciples received when they were persecuted for their faith. Now, in Matthew 5, verse 12, Yeshua said, "Rejoice, be glad in the face of persecution." Why should we be glad? Why should we rejoice? Because we have walked in such a way to draw the attention to ourselves, because we are set apart enough to cause dissonance between us and the enemy, between light and darkness. And that will cause people to respond or react in a negative way towards you. So in that way, it's confirmation that you are on the right path, that you are doing the right thing. You must be wary of the fact if you are not persecuted and if you are not going through anything, because then you are lukewarm and nothing is happening. So you need to ask Yahweh to help you to overcome those internal struggles, because if you don't work with him, there will be a bigger trial coming to help you to overcome that inward gap. So Yahweh gave commendations to the first assembly in the book of Revelation. And what is evident of specifically the first and second century assemblies are that they were persecuted for their faith, and they basically only received commendations. Now, the last assembly, Laodicea, they only received reproof, and they thought that they were in a good place, but they looked at themselves through the eyes of the fleshliness, through the eyes of being comfortable, through the eyes of being blessed, through the eyes of having everything now, having the best life now. That's what they chase, and they miss the point completely. Now, if you expand that over the time frame, we are basically that last generation, which are depicted by Laodicea, and collectively the body of Messiah are not creating a feeling of comfort with Yahweh. He is not happy with the last generation church. So that is what I believe one of the reasons for the Great Tribulation. There need to be trials and tribulation in order to purify the bride. So it's an act of grace to allow persecution and tribulation to come upon his people to cleanse them. So the people who believe in the rapture, the pre-trib rapture, we won't be here. It's the evil people that will be persecuted. No, it is not. It is the people, Yahweh's people, who will go through it. He will guide and protect them during that process, but they will have to go through it. It's a symbolism of the Jordan. Before they entered the promised land, you have to walk through the Jordan. They haven't jumped over it or were raptured prior to it and then came down slowly and landed into the promised land. They had to walk through it. But the waters open up as the priests walk in front of them with the commandments in the form of the tablets and the Ark of the Covenant. And those who walk with the commandments, the waters turned away. So they weren't affected as much as the other people, but they had to go through it anyway. So that's just something for us to be mindful of, that there is tribulation coming because of the body that is not perfect. And Yahweh, through his grace, want to cleanse us. So he will release tribulation to come upon us in the last days. What is faith? Now, I'm first of all just going to look at faith from a normal perspective, or a perspective of normal common teaching. So what people believe nowadays, what faith is they believe faith is believing a fact. And if you believe the fact, then you have faith in it. So believing a truth is basically what faith is. And if you want to take it one step further, you can believe that you will get something, and if you have patience and keep on believing that, it will manifest in your life, and then you will get what you want. Good example, if you want a nice house or a red Porsche or whatever, you just stand firmly in faith and keep on confessing and believing until you receive that house or until you receive that Porsche, and that is what faith is. Now, faith is totally something else. Now, this kind of faith that is skewed is basically the same principle that they teach in a book called The Secret. It's a way of trying to manipulate the spiritual realm to manifest something in the physical. And you act through faith, or through faith means, to get what you want. Now, what Yahweh says is, I will give you the desires of your heart. So that means that his desires will be planted. So his desires will be planted in your heart, and you will desire what he desires. He will not give you your greed, your desire, your lust, and the things that you want. He will change you to want what he wants, and then he will give that to you. So it's just reading the scripture in the right way will purify the word to be in line with the rest of scripture, and skewing the word will confirm the false doctrines that is currently out there regarding faith as well. So what is faith? If we look at faith, as I said, going into the original words, which is currently Greek. So faith in Greek is pistos. That means faith, assurance, belief, moral conviction. It comes from the root word pytho, which means to obey, to trust, have confidence, to believe, or to persuade. Now, what's interesting is that you see that the root word of faith is to obey and to trust. Now, we know that in Hebrew, the word amun means to obey, or the closest to obey. That means faithfulness. So faithfulness is another way to say that I have faith in the truth, and I am faithful doing that truth, or I am obeying that truth. So faithfulness and obedience in a truth is exactly the same thing. So the root word of faith, which is patheo, is exactly the same as the meaning of aman. Now, if you read in the Tanakh, in specifically the Torah, Abraham believed, which is aman, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So what kind of belief made him righteous? The faith that is related to faithfulness, the faith that is really related to obedience, the faith that relates to trust and to have confidence in Yahweh. And he confirmed that through acting upon the truth he received and follow through, offering up his son. And then Yahweh count that as righteousness, not only believing, but acting on the truth and being faithful in. And that is the true meaning of faith. Now, to take that one step further, Aman has a feminine form called Amuna. So it's a hay added at the back. And Amuna means something fixed, like a covenant or a pillar. Now, that word is basically what the word picture in Exodus 17 verse 20 depicts, where Moses was supported by Aaron and Hur in the context of the battle between Israel and Amorites and the Amorites. Now, when Moses' hand with the staff was lifted up, Israel won. And as soon as he slacked his hands and brought down the staff, the Amorites won. So he had to have support in order to uphold the covenant, to uphold and be faithful in the truth. And that's the picture of what faith is, to stand like a pillar and hold fast while the battle is raging. So whenever you go through a trial or a tribulation, it's typically basically a spiritual battle, manifesting in a physical form, attacking your body or attacking your emotions or attacking you physically or spiritually. But you need to hold fast and hold that standard up, that standard of Yahweh's word, and then the victory will come. So Yahweh has given us this promise within this word picture that relates to that Greek word, which is called faith. Now he said the testing of your faith produces patience. Now taking this one step further, this was fascinating when I discovered this, is that patience, from our perspective, is to sit on a chair and wait and not make a move, not be irritable or trying to do something else. You just sit there and wait till you get what you are waiting for. Now, that's one type of being patient. The Greek explains this a bit better. It's the word hapumon, which means to be patient, to wait for something, which I explained. But the other part of it is more relevant to what James is referring to. It's steadfastness and endurance. That's typically what Amuna is. To hold up the standard, to be steadfast during the raging battle. And patience is produced by faith. But we see that the Greek faith and the Greek patience linking to Amuna are one and the same thing. So that's why the one can produce the other. It's an outshoot of faith. Patience is an outshoot of faith, or basically the same thing, being steadfastness and endurance. Now, Yeshua used this word in Luke 8 verse 15, where he explained the parable of the sower, where he said, "But that on the good ground are they, which in an honest and good heart, having heard the word, kept it." Now, the word kept it also means to obey it and bring forth fruit with patience. So this means that they received the seed of the word, they obeyed it, so they were faithful in that, and their faithfulness had the consequence or the reaction of bearing fruit. So there was something coming from it. And that's similar to Abraham, who received the word, he kept it, so he acted upon it, and he brought forth fruit. He gave us the means of understanding what it means to offer up your only son, which is a picture of Mashiach being offered up by the Father and establishing the covenant. And that's also linked to Amuna, to be something fixed, like a pillar or like a covenant. It cannot be moved, and it's upholding something. So with that, it's done with patience. So the main idea here is obedience, and that we saw from the root word of faith in Greek, which is paitho, which is to obey and to trust. So we see the same meaning over and over confirmed. So patience and the root word of pistos are basically the same, one and the same meaning. And what's associated there is that there will be fruit from your action if you stand fast in this truth and be faithful till the end. Now, all of that is in the backdrop of what I explained, which is the wilderness. So you need the truth first, or the seed first, before you can stand fast in it during the raging battle that happens within the wilderness. So you only have a chance to overcome if you embrace the word, if you embrace the seed, if you embrace the commandments, in order to overcome the enemy in the wilderness and bear fruit in the wilderness. So that is something to keep in mind. The outcome of a raging battle, and if you stand fast, will always bear fruit. There will always be something to gain from that. There's an outcome that will bless you if you endure till the end. So that is a very important gem to take from this passage in James. Now, the other thing that we have a misconception is we think that we will overcome the enemy through patience by just waiting for Yahweh to take care of it. But it's actually together with your endurance that will allow you to overcome. Now, if you just believe that you overcome when the persecution stops or when the battle stops, then that is only half the story, because a lot of people in the time of the New Testament were persecuted and they died for their faith. So they never overcome the physical, but they overcame in the spiritual, in the inner man, because they held fast until the end. And they hope to get victory over the enemy. Did not happen, but the change inside of them happened, and they built that character. And that was what Yahweh was interested in, not the physical overcoming the issue, the sickness, the situation, but the internal endurance and the internal victory that needs to happen first. You might receive, or there's probably a good chance that you will overcome if you read the story of Job, that Yahweh will bless you and multiply you after the battle has been won. But there's some cases, as recorded, that you might not reach that point, but the inner work that will happen is the victory for us. So we need to be joyous for that victory on the inside. So patience versus faith, I already touched on this. The connection between Hopophone and Amuna, that it has to do with steadfastness, endurance, support, and to be faithful in something, to obey something. So I made just a short little mathematical, if you like, representation of the imbalance and how that can have cause and effect. So a lack of faith will automatically cause an imbalance that will start to release trials in your life. And trials is the backdrop and the situation you are in. And if you endure and be patient and faithful and stand fast during the trial, your faith will be built up. And if you receive faith, then your character will be built. And after your character is built, the enemy will be overcome. Just like the storyline with Moses, Aaron, Hur, Israel, and the Amorites. So to complete that, to overcome the trial, is to overcome the lack of faith, not only the enemy. And also to gain the fruit of this is you will build faith, build character, and have a stronger faith and a testimony at the end of time, at the end of that process. So that is the outcome that we need to rejoice in, the outcome that we need to look at, that we need to long for while we within that situation. Not to give up, not to think negative thoughts, or to be impatient, or not to have faith, but to have faith in the outcome, which is I will become perfect in my character. I will receive more strength and more faith as I go through this, and I will become more like him. I will know him more after this experience. And that's what we need to focus on, not the issue, not the pain, not this sickness, or not whatever you go through, but the outcome. Endurance guarantees salvation. Now, this is where Yeshua used the same word in Luke 21, verse 12 to 19, explaining patience, endurance, and steadfastness in the context of persecution. But this is an end time context. So he's basically talking to us living in the last generation, where he says, but before all these things, that is basically the great tribulation he's talking about, before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. And you will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. But it will turn and it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore, settle in your heart not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience, you possess your souls. Now, this was an interesting verse, this verse 19. By your patience, you will possess your soul. This is the same patience that we are talking about, the endurance. And possess is what makes this an interesting concept. What Yeshua is saying here. Possess is the word ketomai, that means to purchase, to own, or to possess. So it's similar to the idea of redemption. When you buy something, you redeem something. And that's also the same concept of what we know when Yeshua paid with his blood. By his blood, we are redeemed, because his blood is the currency he paid for our sin. So we do not have to pay for our own sin, for our own lives, paying the penalty of eternal death or eternal separation. So in this context, it alludes to the idea that he places the onus on us to preserve our salvation. Now, how do we preserve that? We need to stand fast while we are persecuted, because if you renounce him or if you turn your back on him during persecution, you are basically risking your salvation. By patience and endurance, you have the power to possess or to own your soul, to keep your soul from being lost. And that's between the lines, what I read from this, that we can lose our salvation if we turn our backs against him. And he also says that in Revelation, if you receive the mark of the beast, you're basically done, because you have renounced me through that act of unbelief. So we need to stand fast. Even if they persecute you until death, you need to hold fast, because if you release his hand, if you let go of his hand, you will fall. And that is falling from his grace if you turn your back on him, releasing his hand of salvation. So that's just an interesting way the word patience is used in relation to possession, that links to redemption, that links to salvation, that connects with endurance during a time of tribulation or persecution. So that's a message to us as the last generation. And Yahweh is basically encouraging us and reminding us that we need to stand fast, because we will be persecuted. It's not if, it is when. So we need to understand how to preserve our souls and how to make sure that we still end up at the end of the day with not a hair being touched from our heads. All right, so the wilderness, as I said, is a picture of traveling from Sinai to the promised land. There is no quick route. There's no flights, there's no airplane or helicopter, nothing that can pick you up from Sinai and drop you off in the promised land. You have to walk through the wilderness. We have to walk through this life in the wilderness. There will be persecution, there will be trials, there will be enemies. Now, the picture Israel went through, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. Number 40 is also the number of the work of Messiah. And he is doing a work within you during the wilderness period, which consists of trials and tribulations. Now, the reason why Israel went through trials and tribulations because they did not act in belief, they act in unbelief, when only 2 of the 12 spies came back with a good report, and they basically believed the 10 spies with a bad report. And that's when Yahweh decided to cleanse them, to purify them through the wilderness, and leading them through the wilderness for 40 years for that reason. So, as I said, faith is a spiritual concept. The wilderness is designed to elevate the spirit and to kill the flesh, to minimize the fleshiness, so that your neshama can overpower and rule over the nefesh, so you can walk as a righteous man and woman of God. So the other key things you need to understand working with Yahweh throughout this period of the wilderness, going through trials and tribulations, is to always be humble, always be ready to learn, and always to do inward inspection, and trying to find out what can you change and how can you work with Yahweh to shorten this period of suffering. Because as soon as you learn, as soon as you overcome on the inside, the outside will be back into balance, and the persecution might turn away. So the quicker you learn, the quicker the test will be over. So basically, that is the key learning from this. So the next word we're going to look at is perfection. He said, but let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Now we think that this perfection is about having a house, having food, having a job. You don't lack anything. But he's actually talking about lacking nothing spiritually. And that completeness and that perfection is a work that, or result of the perfect work he is doing inside of you. Now, the word perfect is the word teleos, which means brought to its end, finished, wanting nothing, full grown, adult, and mature. So perfection is actually another way of saying you have reached perfection, or you have reached maturity. And a sign of maturity is not wanting anything. And that's why you don't lack anything. Now, that want or that desire we discussed previously, that is the word hava or hova. And that is the enemy of talut, which is emptiness, longing, humility. And that's the character of Mashiach. Now, to desire and to want is the character of fleshliness. And we need to become like him. And if you grow into a maturity level, a spiritual maturity level of, a spiritual mature level, you will lack less and less, because you want less and less. You no longer desire this big house and that thing, and I don't longer desire that person's gift or that one's talent or whatever they have. You will deal with your issues, with your life. You will be thankful and grateful for what you have, and the challenge you go through. You'll work through it with Yahweh, and you will grow up in maturity and into that perfection which he planned for you, doing a perfect work within you. Now, I've got a picture there of working with clay. So the forming of a clay pot, before you form the clay, you have to beat the clay to get the bubbles out, to get the consistency right. And that's the persecution and the trials and the molding and the things that need to happen before you can be put on the pedestal and be spinned into this beautiful container that can contain his pure water. And if you are a container and you reach that perfection and that maturity, you can now carry his water and his word into this dark world and give people water. You can give them his word. And that's why I said, inward springs will flow from you. And that's due to that perfection that you reach, that maturity you reach, or that clay pot or that container you became that can actually carry his word into this world. So that is basically why we go through these things, because there's a goal, there's an end. We also see the same symbolism in the Feast of Trumpets, where the trumpet is made from one piece of I forgot, silver, and it's beaten out into a trumpet. So that beating of the silver is that purification process and that forming process, so that that trumpet can sound, can make that sound, that warning sound or that calling sound for Yahweh to call the people in. So we cannot become a trumpet or a voice for him unless we are beaten first, unless we are formed first, unless we became mature first. So the process of maturity is a process of going through these trials and tribulations and tests and removing all the impurities so that we can overcome the old man and let the new man, or the mature spiritual side of us, the neshama, rule over our fleshly bodies. Now, growing up into spiritual maturity can also be explained by the hand of a little baby that is born. Now, as soon as a baby is born, that first couple of days and even the first couple of weeks, the baby is in its most immature, selfish state. It's not a bad thing. It's just because they can't help themselves. Everybody needs to do everything for them. So when someone new become born again, they need to be spoon-fed. They need to be cleansed. They need to be helped. They need to have guidance. And it all needs to be done in a loving, kind way. Just like you don't abuse the baby for crying because they're hungry, you can't abuse a young believer telling them off because they make a mistake. They don't know any better. They still struggle with flesh, maybe. You need to support them. You need to help them and guide them in a loving way. Now, the next phases of the baby is when they start to crawl. Now, when they crawl, they experience the world through feeling and taste. And that's basically where we need to start to teach them not to rely on their feelings and not want to eat everything. And that's where the commandments regarding clean eating comes in, and the commandments that come into regarding morality. Not to follow the lust of the flesh, which includes food. So we need to give them guidance there so that they can grow into maturity. Then the next phase is where they start to stand up against things and they trying to move around. There's a lot of falling, a lot of stumbling, a lot of crying happening there. So we need to be patient with these young believers as they struggle, as they fall, as they still trip over their bad habits and do things that might be look like they backslidden or they fall back into the world. We just need to bring them back with love and support them. And as the baby grow up, then they start walking. But as you walk, you lose focus on what's on the ground. You just want to see where you're going, and then you trip over things. So you need to learn wisdom, where to look. Make sure that you set your feet upon solid ground. Avoid the holes, avoid the stumbling blocks, the things that you have in your past that tripped you up. Avoid them, step over them. Don't dabble around them. Don't dance around it. Don't fellowship with people who will pull you down. You need that kind of wisdom embedded in them. You need to support people. The next phase is as the baby even grow up into a young boy or girl, then they can start to run. That's when the next challenge comes into. Now they've got this new skill and this power and experience. They just want to express that. But the more speed, the more danger. And you need to give them wisdom in order to control that abilities that they achieved. And that's basically where you receive the Yahweh spirit and enough knowledge of the word. It can either go into wildfire where people do crazy things, or you can become very legalistic and bash people to death with the Bible. So you need that wisdom and that balance to control that power that you received. You've got the power of the truth and the word. You've got the power of the spirit. You need to keep that in balance and deal with that in wisdom. Otherwise, it will destroy other people around you. The last slide we're going to look at is the perfect work. Now, work is the word ergon. That means to work or to toil. That's to do with your occupation. It's an act or a deed, doing labor or work. And that work is what makes you perfect. And this work is referred to as a perfect work. So we know that this work being done in you is a work from Yahweh. He is doing the work inside of you. Now, for this work to happen, we can explain that in the context of a science experiment, for example, where you need to create the perfect environment for that chemical reaction to take place. So you have to boil it to a certain temperature and add the right amount of this substance to that substance for that perfect reaction to take place to get the outcome that you want. Now, that perfect environment for that perfect work to happen is basically what we call the wilderness, or where the trials and tribulations happen. We need that energy to be added, that dissonance to be created, that challenge to be added to you in order to feel the process of change within you. If those things don't happen, you will be happy with the status quo. You will just be in the state where you're at and not want to change because you will think that you have arrived. But Yahweh wants to create you into perfection. So he will create the right environment around you to add enough energy for you to move from one level to another. And that environment is the wilderness experience. So it's not a bad thing. And the fruit that we will get from that is perfection, maturity, to be more like him. And that's why we count it all joy. Not while we're in it, counting it joy because we enjoy pain. No, we count it all joy because we have faith in the fruit, have faith in the one doing the work in us, and have faith that it is a perfect work that will lead to perfection within us. The other thing we need to understand is that Yahweh is within every bad situation. He's hidden within every bad situation and every challenge. And that we saw in the storyline of Jacob meeting Esau in the context of Jacob's trials. So he went through trials and tribulations facing his brother after 20 years, knowing that his brother wanted to kill him. And his brother and 400 other men approached him. And he got news of this and he freaked out. But 400 plus 1 is 401. And that's the number for adding the Aleph and the Taf. So the Aleph Taf is hidden within the trial and tribulation that is approaching. So Yahweh is in it. He is closer than he ever going to be while you're in it, in that situation. So that's where you make contact with him. That's where you can reach out to him, where you will hear him more clearly, where you experience him more clearly, because he is closer than you think. So we need to take advantage of the trials and tribulations in our lives to access him, to access his wisdom, to access his perfect work, and to work with him so that we can grow into perfection while we go through these challenges. And that is what we need to be joyous about. So that basically concludes tonight's study. So I just want to open up to you guys if you want to ask any questions or make any comments.
Yeah, I just want to ask something.
Yes.
So what about when you have a disability that you're born with? Does that mean that we've got a lot of work to do in ourselves for a long, long time?
Well, there are examples in scripture where there's people who are born with disabilities. And there was a point in time where Yeshua met with them and he healed the blind person. He helped the lame person to walk again. So there's always hope to overcome the physical disability. But while you are within that state of imperfection, you should look at the fruit of the outcome of the work he's doing within you and take advantage of him being closer to you than other people who don't have that. So
Definitely.
see it in that positive way, because your challenge you're going through makes you more special to him than people who's not going through that challenge.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you take the wisdom from what we learned tonight.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah,
I saw a video on YouTube from a lady who was in a wheelchair, and she went up for prayer time and time and time again. I don't know how many years she was disappointed time and time again. And at the end, she gave a testimony, and she actually said all the things that Yahweh done within her because of that situation made that situation worthwhile because she grew so much spiritually.
Yeah.
So I will see if I can find that video again. I'll send it to you. So that was really encouraging coming from someone who's in that.
Great.
It's easy for me to say that because I'm not in it.
Yes.
But it's good to hear it from someone who's going through it.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
But it does give you opportunity to go one way or the other way. You know, really.
Yeah, so your attitude, your attitude will determine which way this is going to go. Either your faith will be depleted and destroyed, or it will be built up. And you have the power to push it in the right direction. And he will work with you. And we need to work with him. Yeah.
Praise God, yeah. Thank heavens we have him.
Yes, that's all we have.
Do without him.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
That makes us more dependent upon him if we go through these things, if we're in those things. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
It's Hazel. During the week, we were listening to Rabbi Kurt Schneider from somewhere in America, and he was talking on faith, and I thought he said it was Emunah, E-M-U-N-A-H. But he talked about ruling the earth. God has got a good purpose from Romans 8:28. We're to cling to him, to trust him, to take refuge from Psalm 91. And faith is a gift from Hebrews 11:1, substance, and fear God as in wisdom. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, that supports what we talked about tonight. Yeah, I know that I also discovered that passage that said that faith is a gift. So if you don't have faith, you can ask and he will give you faith. It's a gift. You just need to receive it. So you don't have to try and get it from somewhere else. You just need to pray and ask him and he will give you more faith. He will give you that strength, that inner strength through his spirit.
Thank you.
I guess that's the faith comes from hearing the word.
That is, that's the key. Without the word, there's no faith, because faith is based on the word that's synonym with truth. So real faith or true faith can only be based upon truth, not a lie. And that's the power of faith, because it's backed up by truth.
Any more questions? Yeah. I think we've finished questions here. If you're happy to close, Philip.
Yes, no, my pleasure. Well, thank you for another opportunity to share. May you all be blessed tonight and tomorrow and the week coming, and may Yahweh do a perfect work in each and every one of us. Father, I just thank you for your word and your truth, and that you encourage us, even if we go through trials and tribulations, through tough times. Some of us understand it better than others, that we can still rejoice and have joy and know that there's fruit, know there's an outcome, and we can trust in you, and that we are not alone, that you have been persecuted, you went through things, you paid the ultimate price unto death. And help us, Father, give us that inner strength and give us your faith, your gift of faith, so we can be strong and we can uphold your truth and not waver, not compromise, not even in the normal life, but also within very extreme challenges and tribulations and trials we all might go through. Father, I just ask that you have mercy upon us, that you help us, and that you be with us and bless us, first spiritually and then physically. I ask it all in the mighty name of Yeshua Mashiach. Amen.